Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The usual suspects in the city have so many opportunities to hear each other talking that one wouldn't expect the previous round to sit here to listen for another time. So don't take it personally if they leave the room. It's a big pleasure and honor for me to be here because on the one hand, it's the first time to be in this building. On the other hand, I am for many, many years a very strong and personal supporter of the work of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. Actually, when the whole thing started, I was sitting in my office at the Freie Universität something like 20 years ago, and a young, energetic student came in and asked if I could help him to get an internship at an Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. I thought, this sounds cool. I wish we would have something like an Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. I'm very sorry. I know a lot of people in Berlin, but there is no such thing. And this young, energetic person founded it. And now 20 years later, we sit here and have the opportunity to benefit from his powerful achievement of keeping it alive for 20 years. Because if you do non-profit work, then it usually never flies in terms of economic success. But I found it's very important to have something like this and to bring the world and the youth of the world together and make the world a better place by better understanding in formats like this. So when I received an invitation, I thought I should not just come and provide a speech, but I should bring the world. And I come with 14 students from the Freie Universität Berlin International Summer University, FUBIS. And we try to understand what the European Union is and does. And normally we sit in class in the morning and do discussions, presentations, and have academic readings, and then so many questions that we don't know who could answer it. And then we go to the city and meet an expert who by job description is expected to have answers for our challenging questions. And today, for logistical reasons, we ran out of a speaker, and suddenly, out of the blue, the ICD came and said, hey, would you like to come and spend the afternoon with us? So here we are, and I switch roles, and do not just sit in the back and let my students ask questions and they say, thanks for having us, but instead I give a talk. So the talk was not mine, I didn't choose it, but I sometimes like it very much if you get homework, like a task. And the task I got today is titled The United States of Europe Model, Past, Present and Future, which I personally find a bit funny because it is so ivory tower-like as a task. It has not so much to do with what's actually going on in the European Union, but it is, from an educational point of view, very useful because sometimes even if we ask a dry or some sort of not very close to political reality question, we can also learn a great deal from it. And since I have 30 minutes, I thought I structure my presentation or intervention in 5 steps and make 5 statements and explain what I mean by these 5 statements. So the first one is the EU is rather the United States of Europe already than it is the European Union. What do I mean by that? If we compare the European Union with the United States of America, then one would think that the EU isn't completed yet, and we need to go on until we finally meet the expectation that is expressed in the model, like the United States of Europe. But if we have a closer look at the term, then a United States focuses on the parts. So when the European Union calls itself a European Union, then it's actually the wrong term, and the United States of America should rather call themselves the United America, and we should switch titles, and then we would actually describe what we are. The United States is much more united than the European Union is, because the European Union consists of states, which is what I mean by the United States of Europe. And at that point, I could go home and say, okay, this is it. But this was not what you wanted. It was more like to highlight the very nature of the two concepts. So what we have here is kind of a construction site of the European house that consists of sovereign states, and it's currently 28 and counting, or next year we count one less, but there might be more coming up because we still have candidate countries, and it's not clearly defined what it wants to become in the future, but it consists of sovereign states, and the sovereign states did not shift sovereignty on a European level. This was my first point on the United States of Europe model. Second point, European integration does not follow a script. So we work with models, we work with historical analogies to describe what is the nature of the beast. And this is useful because it helps to identify differences, and through the differences we can see, like in the panel before, that the EU is not a global power, which of course also needs to be defined. If we would have talked about economic integration, then it's still the largest GDP in cumulated size. And by bringing the size to the negotiation table, of course you are a global power. And given all the patterns and norms and international standards, it also structures how globalization works when it is about a flow of goods, people, capital, labor, everything also needs a framework in which this happens. And from that point of view, the EU is very powerful, but as I point out in my second point, it doesn't follow a script in the sense that the founding fathers define what they had in mind as the United States of Europe. And then we are in some sort of a linear phase from zero integration to complete integration to do them a favor to finally reach the point that they were dreaming of. If this would be the model, then forget about it. There is no such model, neither in the dreams, or maybe in the dreams of the founding fathers, but the founding fathers are long gone and the world has changed a lot. So even if there would be a script, the script might not be sufficient to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, and we are better more flexible and respond according to the challenges or the pressure or internal innovation to modernize the way of policy making that then makes what Samuel Müller was pointing out as his understanding of European values. So if it's not following according to a script, it's neither something like, oh, Germany united through a certain model in the 19th century and Europe should do the same, or we look at the United States of America and say, hey, why not having a civil war because that helps us to unite? We rather don't and follow our own concept of integration or unification without defining from the start what the finalité politique, as we put it in French lingua franca terms, should look like. But this leads me to my third one. If an open finalité politique is the very nature of the project, that we started with something and then the something was meant to allow deepening and widening parallel or one after another without telling what the final destination should be, then it is a coin with two sides. And the one side is it's great to respond to different perceptions, different problems, different challenges, different achievements, to rethink, is the political structure of this kind of a federal system, by avoiding the F word, because as we all know, F words have very often a negative connotation, and this F word, federal, sounds too highly centralist for someone from Britain or from the United States, while ironically for someone like me, coming from the Federal Republic of Germany, it is the decentralization lesson we learned from a fully centralized totalitarian Nazi regime. So the consequence of experiencing what it's like to fully centralize power in one person or one authority is to decentralize power, to make it more economically efficient, and also to get closer to individuals, to the people. And this was what Sergei was pointing out, that part of our value DNA is to define the relationship between the individual human beings and the state, which is why we have human rights in general in this world. So if the open finality is open, then the good thing is it's super flexible and we are not sort of dependent on there's only one way to do it according to the blueprint of the founding fathers and the linear process, as if European integration is already predefined in the book of fate and we only fulfill the tasks one generation after another. This would make no sense because there is innovation in academia, that new models pop up. There are new perspectives on, is an achievement actually an achievement, or shall we also look at the downsides? If this is an ongoing social discourse, and this was also highlighted by the panelists, then it should be possible to rethink a certain direction and rather move to another direction. If this is what the demos or the 28 demoi, if that's, I'm not Greek, the plural of demos, but you know what I'm talking about. If they decide differently, then they should have a chance to correct it. The flip side of this flexibility of an open finalité is that it's extremely complicated to fall in love with a construction site. And if the EU doesn't decide, hey, this is the European house, or it's a fortress, or it's a marketplace, or it's an ongoing change, and it constantly changes its name, its mechanism, its share of competences, and so on, how can you expect a human being to give his or her heart to a European house in the making that tomorrow sounds different, like from European Community to European Union, and doesn't really tell you what the final destination should be? So this causes major problems with acceptance. If people need to take FUBIS courses every second year to understand what is the current state of European integration, is it still called like this? How many members are currently in, and how do we adjust the separation of competences and the separation of power? So this is something to keep in mind, which also explains the problems of legitimacy in the 21st century. Because what we see, and this is my fourth point, is, to make it sound a bit more academic, interdependence as an alternative to nationalism, this is the story from the beginning, created a peace zone that was even awarded with a Nobel Prize for Peace with high exit costs. So what I meant by this is academic is that a lot of it, or a lot what I tried to say, is put into one sentence that needs further explanation. Interdependence is the idea of we become so dependent on each other that we can't live without respecting the interests of our neighbor, because otherwise we will shoot ourselves in the foot or the knee, depending in which language we are talking about shooting oneself. And the alternative to nationalism is that the diagnosis of the founding fathers, who had an idea what the final destination should be, was we all got into trouble because too many European states thought that their nation is superior over others. And if that leads to World War I and World War II, we can only avoid World War III if we replace the nationalism idea, my nation is better than yours, by a new idea. And this is interdependence. And by working for half a century on becoming so dependent on each other through economic means, and now also with PESCO and Justice and Home Affairs in external security and internal security, it becomes extremely expensive to say goodbye to the club, because you transformed your economic, your political, your cultural, your social, your norm system into something that is massively Europeanized. And this is on the one hand a good thing because it brings peace. You can't afford to attack your neighbor, but it makes it also very difficult if a majority of the club believes that Europe should turn into this type of a European house and you feel isolated because your concept of the future of Europe is no longer fully represented, then it might be the better option to leave, what the Brexiteers believe is the case. But the costs that you face will then become prohibitively expensive if things work not well and if we don't find a common denominator. But if we find a common denominator, it might also invite others to maximize short-term benefits if you declare your independence or your separation or what else you can declare. Which leads me to my fifth and last point, which is about the future. And this is also something very lovely at the ICD, that we often get homework to look into the future, because we are members of academia and we all have a crystal ball at home to see what European integration will bring. So if we look into a crystal ball but we don't have one, then the second best option is to play with scenarios. And the scenario the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, came up with a year ago to initiate what our committed Europeans described as a deliberative process, that we sit down and talk and come to a conclusion what the best result for the next step of European integration could look like, was a variation of paths for further integration that takes different movements seriously. And the first one was, let's just carry on as always. So we don't need to change anything. European integration is a success story. It's slow, but it creates an institutionalized form of minority right protection. So we should appreciate what we have. Similar to the first round of answers, well, it's actually not so bad, and we perform pretty well, and so many people risk their life to come here, so it must be not so bad after all. So that was the first one. If we don't agree on any major changes, let's keep on going. We have institutions. They quietly produce results on a daily basis, so not much of a deal. Sooner or later, we will fix all the major problems because we have an engineering type of policy making already in place. This was number one. Number two was, Britain doesn't like anything that smells political. They joined a single market or a free trade area and a customs union with a bit of flanking policies. So if we go back to what it used to be, a European community for economic integration, then they would happily stay within the club, and then everything would be fine. This, in my understanding, is a total misunderstanding of what this whole thing is about. Because if my interdependence intervention from earlier makes any sense, then it is about there is no such thing as a purely economic form of integration, because everything has multiple dimensions, and you can of course call it an economic community, but it has always been, right from the start, political, cultural, social, internal security, external security related, and it was only instrumentalizing econ textbooks form of integration to get the work done. So dreaming of a single market pure is a total misunderstanding what a single market is. It is a textbook model, but not much more. So it helps to identify what are the costs and benefits if you translate it into money. But all the other side effects outside of your purely economic model is still there, but outside of your model. So it's not covered by your research design. And therefore, in my understanding, it's an illusion given the level of interdependence that we have reached already. The third one takes into consideration that member states have different interests regarding the deepening and widening of integration. Some want to move ahead. Some want to deepen in areas that others see essential for the concept of sovereignty. There are different definitions of what is high politics. For some countries, it's language policy, because if you give up your language, then the container of your culture is gone, while for others, it's even food. The reason why the French hate the idea of opening a market for services has a lot to do with the French language, the chansons, and the way the agricultural sector is designed. So every country has different sensitive spots and allows further integration under certain restrictions, which leads to some sort of concentric circles or overlapping club memberships in a much more differentiated form of integration than a one-size-fits-all United States of Europe. Everyone is committed to the same norms, standards, values, and is fully integrated in every single policy. This has never been the case. We have exceptions in Schengen, in the Eurozone, in PESCO, in whatever, but it was always the lifeline of the club that sooner or later everyone will be on board in every aspect of integration. So you can dream the dream of, at the very end, everything will be the same, but the reality is that we have centrifugal and centripetal developments, and right now with all the populist and nationalist movements, it smells more like further integration is not the common denominator anymore, and we have to respond to it with more differentiation, which sounds perfectly flexible, and every member state can join some sort of a tailor-made menu of integration. But the flip side is that those who are in the driver's seat in the deepest possible circle of integration define the rules for the others. And this leads to a situation in which this highly appreciated minority right protection concept is no longer in place because you have no say. And this is in essence the highest cost of Brexit for a country that voluntarily gives up the say in institutions for the illusion of sailing alone and ruling the waves or whatever they dream of in protecting their Westminster model, while the rest of the gang is creating a reality that massively affects Britain simply because of their location and their high level of interdependence. So the concentric circles look attractive, but they will come with high costs for those who are either not willing or not able to meet the next level of threshold that you have to pass to be a fully accepted member of the club. Which leads me to the fourth point of the 5 scenarios of Juncker, which is focusing on certain priorities, which sounds a bit like the single market shopping list. Like if we only do things better in a selected area of those things in which Europeanization makes sense, then the member states could convince their people that it's not a major loss of autonomy, but we also get things done, which is sort of the combination of input legitimacy, that you have an active role, and at the same time output legitimacy, that the EU gets something done and you are convinced by the quality of the results. This again ignores where we are. If we would start from scratch and would define we have 3, 4, 5 priorities and we concentrate on them, could be a model. But given the fact that we have already 60 years of European integration that changed the nature of the member states, then focusing on certain priorities would only lead to a situation in which everything that is not prioritized will be neglected. And then people who lose from a lack of priority in the areas that are not identified as a priority would claim that this is a reason for leaving the club, or they need compensations for this and that. And we have a number of examples in which the level of integration isn't high, like currently minority migration policy, in which every country that suffers from a lack of Europeanized migration policy claim that the European Union should do more. So this is clearly one of the cases in which, if it would have been prioritized in the past, we wouldn't have debates in the Mediterranean countries that they feel neglected or ignored in their problems. Which leads me to the last one, which sounds a bit like the United States of Europe model. But the problem with the model is that in times of the 21st century, we don't have an elite, like enlightened leaders that tell us, listen guys, this is good for you and I execute it and you as condition takers will see the long-term benefits from it. This is not how politics work in at least the Western world these days. We are in a deliberative process in which we have to get the demos on board, and it's about a beauty contest of who has the best solutions, and then we go on elections and see what the demos believes in the quality of the different proposals. So if no one could take the risk to lobby for the United States of Europe, because that would come with a very high price tag for each and every member state to shrink to the dimension of a region or an arrondissement or a Bundesland, then it might be good to think in terms of what could be more Europeanized, or what would be the final stage of integration if you want to play with an alternative to where we are in this construction site of a European house. But in my understanding, there's neither a mass movement out there of 510 million Europeans who can't wait to be citizens of the United States of Europe, nor is there a very strong group of member states, not to speak of political parties, who see their mission in uniting Europe in something like the ultimate federal state. It's good to have something like federal movements or the Europa Union, or however these NGOs call themselves, because in a pluralist system it's important to represent whatever possible perspective within the range of our set of values. But I just don't see at this time of the development of European integration that any powerful force would want the United States of Europe and could explain that with this fully centralized system, we could fix the problems that the European Union is facing, not to speak of anything that is ahead of us that simply hasn't arrived yet here. On this maybe not so happy note, I rather stop here because I didn't check the time. It feels like 30 minutes, and that's what matters. Thank you very much.